Supposed Bible contradiction. Were the disciples told to stay in Jerusalem or to go to Galilee? The Gospel of Mark says that after the resurrection, Jesus would appear to the disciples in Galilee. Matthew adds that the disciples met Jesus on a mountain where they were given the Great Commission, and then his Gospel ends without mentioning the ascension or anything after that. However, Luke doesn't mention anything with regards to Galilee. Instead, Luke 24 implies Jesus appeared to the disciples in Jerusalem. Then he told them to remain there, and then he led them to Bethany, where the ascension took place. And all of this is implied to have happened on the same day. The Gospel of John says there were appearances first in Jerusalem and then in Galilee. And he also never mentions the ascension. His Gospel ends by noting Jesus did many other things that were not written in his Gospel. So John's silence regarding the other events mentioned in the other Gospels is not an issue. The real tension is between Matthew and Luke, since Matthew says the disciples were to go to Galilee, and Luke 24:49 says the disciples were to remain in Jerusalem. And Luke also implies the resurrection and the ascension happened on the same day, not leaving enough time for appearances in Galilee. Well, we need to remember, as we noted in previous videos, there are ancient literary devices at work. Matthew and Luke are both likely conflating and compressing the events after the resurrection to simplify the account for their audiences. This is clear, especially when we read Acts 1, where Luke says Jesus remained on earth for 40 days between his resurrection and the ascension. In Luke 24, Luke has greatly compressed this period of time to make the account flow more smoothly. As we noted in previous videos, in non-Western and ancient cultures, chronological sequence is not as important as structuring events into a coherent narrative flow. Events could be out of order, conflated, or compressed. What mattered to the ancient audience was the narrative flow, and that the events were structured into a coherent fashion. For example, in Life of Lucullus, we are informed that Lucullus was granted a triumph on the second attempt to grant him one. But in Life of Cato Minor, Plutarch only briefly focused on the end result. Plutarch likely compressed the events in Life of Cato Minor to focus more on his main character. There are more details of the triumph in Life of Lucullus because he is the focus of that biography. Plutarch compressed many other events that are expanded upon in other biographies. Richards and O'Brien say, in the non-Western world, stories often circulate around the event until it coalesces. Therefore, orderliness, but not the chronological sequence, is important. Because of Acts 1, Luke is obviously aware that Jesus did not ascend on the same day he resurrected. But to improve the narrative flow of his gospel, he has compressed the account and passed over other appearances that happened between the resurrection and the ascension. Which is why in his gospel, it seems as if the resurrection and the ascension happened on the same day. Moreover, this is not an uncommon theme in Luke and Acts. We see other places where Luke jumps ahead, skipping over large sections of time. For the conclusion of his gospel, this was likely done to improve the narrative flow. But since he adds in Acts that Jesus remained on earth longer than one day, there would have been plenty of time for events to play out in Galilee that Matthew and John highlight, before the disciples were told to remain in Jerusalem and the ascension took place. So in other words, Luke has employed the literary device of conflation, which is when an author combines elements from two or more events or people and narrates them as one. The author has conflated them. Accordingly, some displacement and/or transferal will always occur in the conflation of stories. As Licona notes, we see this device in the lives of Plutarch. To give one example, in Cato Minor 31:1 to 33:3, Plutarch gives treatment to the two agrarian laws that were presented on different occasions, January and late April 59. However, in Pompey 47:3 to 48:3 and Caesar 14:1 to 7, Plutarch conflates these two occasions and presents the proposal and ratification of the laws as though on one occasion. And in Pompey, Plutarch conflates a third event, the proposal and ratification of the law extending Caesar's provincial command for 5 years. Likewise, Luke has likely utilized this literary device as well, and has combined elements from the first appearance to the disciples with later instructions that happened just before the ascension, all in an effort to compress and simplify the ending of his gospel. So given this literary device, and the additional details in Acts, there is no reason to assume Luke meant to teach that Jesus ascended the same day he resurrected. His instruction to remain in Jerusalem can be seen as something that took place just before the ascension. Now Matthew has probably also compressed and instead focused on events that happened in Galilee, and then ended his gospel there for literary reasons. Mike Licona also suggests Matthew and Mark may have transplanted the initial appearance to Galilee in order to simplify. But why does Matthew compress and end in Galilee without mentioning the ascension? The reason likely is, as Craig Keener notes, throughout his gospel, Matthew places a strong emphasis on the importance of Jesus' Galilean ministry. So ending in Galilee would fit with an overarching theme. Earlier in his gospel, Matthew cites scripture to show the messianic role the region of Galilee was thought to play. Second, Matthew also ends his gospel with the Great Commission, to proclaim the gospel to all nations, not just the Jewish population. Keener notes Galilee was surrounded by Gentile cities, and so Matthew, ending his gospel without mentioning the return to Jerusalem a few weeks later for the ascension, and instead ending his gospel with Jesus giving the Great Commission in a region where there were more Gentile cities, may have better fit with an overarching theme in Matthew, where he wanted to set up the mission of the early church. Merely choosing not to mention the ascension does not necessarily mean he didn't think it happened. Instead, to fit with a few important themes in his narrative, it makes sense for him to focus on events in Galilee and end with the Great Commission, to create a more impactful narrative he played out throughout his gospel. Within their cultural context, such literary devices could be employed and were expected to be utilized to improve the narrative flow. We only have a contradiction if we impose our modern cultural expectations. But within the cultural context of the ancient world, these literary devices were often used without being seen as creating problems. Matthew either mentions a later appearance during Jesus' 40 days on earth, or has transplanted the first appearance. Luke also has compressed, conflated, and passed over additional appearances that are mentioned in John. So once we factor in the cultural context, this supposed contradiction can be resolved.